Now, you know, we all know that toddlers have emotions. Of course, they've got a limbic system, but it's about kind of the more refined areas of emotions and the more, I guess, conscious emotions rather than the subconscious ones that 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds have. Mind you, I often, there's no 15-year-olds here, are there? No. I often say that actually 2-year-olds and 15-year-olds are very similar in that 2-year-olds are desperately trying to be independent, dressing themselves, feeding themselves, all that kind of stuff. And 15-year-olds are doing exactly the same thing. But it's more emotional, it's more brain stuff that they're trying to be independent on rather than the physical stuff. So it's very similar. So if you can get your 2-year-old on board with the way you like to think, get them to think, then it'll be easy when they're 15. Not sure if it's so easy the other way around. So would you agree with me that, don't worry too much about this column, but this column here, would you agree with me that those might slow down brain development? So a lot of those, what we call vulnerability or at-risk stuff, are around, they actually also slow down brain development because your autonomic nervous system is firing off like mad, you're stressed out, so you don't link in the prefrontal stuff so easily. And therefore, sometimes it's easy to think, I'm not sure if you can make this correlation really, but actually when you look at behaviors, often those things are in common with people who do those things. Yeah? So it seems to me that vulnerability affects brain development, and therefore when you take risks, it's not so easy to make them, get them to succeed. You tend to have worse outcomes. So if you think a bit like that in terms of at-risk vulnerability rather than risky behaviors, it helps you understand the risky behaviors better. And then on the other hand, so two big concepts in youth development really are the whole vulnerability, at-risk, risky behavior stuff, and then the whole protective stuff and strengths-based. And how do we get that prefrontal cortex to link in as early as we can to keep themselves safe rather than us having to keep them safe. So would you agree that that's a fairly good list? So what do you think connectedness means? It comes up in every study I've ever read. WHO study of all high schools in Europe, our own study, Youth 2000 study here. Everybody's aware of our Youth 2000 study? Okay, so, and then the US study, AdHealth study, 90,000 students and their families. So it's based on a lot of research, and this concept comes up over and over again. What do you think it means?
To feel safe.
Yep, to feel safe, yep.
Sense of belonging.
Sense of belonging, absolutely.
Meaningful relationships.
Meaningful relationships.
Sharing.
Sharing, yep, so you're part of something, yep. Well,
be with them, like hang out with them, you like them.
Yep, yep. So,
Not that you have to be.
yep. And we know that the more protective factors on that list you have, the less risky behaviours you do. Lots good research on that. So, and what I love about this graph, you know, rather than saying, no, you mustn't abuse alcohol, no, you mustn't fast drive, no, you mustn't take drugs, no, you mustn't have sex, no, you mustn't steal, no, you mustn't fight. What it's saying is that it'd be nice to do a graph which shows that, but I'll show you something in a minute. But if you do all that, what it shows is that that's much more effective than saying no. Just have to, 3 of them, look at that, and you're coming down to 2 or 3 risky behaviours. And, you know, I think you're allowed 1 risky behaviour, aren't you? Yeah? So the more protective factors you have, the less risky behaviours you have. So we know, don't we, that if you look at somebody who's always in trouble, you look at their histories and you get all that lot, quite often, don't you? And you know if you get 1 risky behaviour, it's usually more, yeah? But if we can introduce this lot, then what happens is those risky behaviours go down. And that's the big message of youth development, really, is rather than say no, put in those protective factors. Get them to a caring adult. Get them to somebody who believes in them. Get them belonging to a group. Give them opportunities. Help them develop a skill. Far more effective than any medication, than any say no's, than any restrictive practice. Far more effective. Teenagers respond to reward, not punishment. Little kids tend to respond to punishment, but teenagers respond to reward. They've got to have somewhere for that dopamine to go. So rewarding them has much better outcomes than punishment. So there's a group in the States who tried to tease out what connectedness means, because it comes up all the time. And what they said, much like what you said, you know, belonging, consistent support, positive, predictable, loving support. They also added the need for regulation, the need for boundaries, the need for structure. Anybody been on a marae? What was it like first time you went on a marae? Right. But for some people, I remember my first time, I was so anxious. Because I thought, oh no, I'm going to put my foot in, I'll do something wrong, I don't know what the rules are. It's the same if, you know, we're all medics, but if you go into a court, how do you feel? And then I've got lawyer friends who say, why are you getting so worked up? There's nothing to get worked up about. You know, and vice versa about hospitals, yeah? So if we know the rules, we feel safe. We feel connected, we belong. So rules are important, respect for individuality. So respect for that growing autonomy. And actually, that's very like authoritative parenting. Do you know all the different forms of parenting? Yep, so there's authoritarian, shut up, sit down, listen. There's authoritative, shut up, listen, sit down, listen, and we'll talk about it. There's permissive, sit anywhere you like. There's neglectful, is there a chair? And then these days there's, oh, I'll sit next to you and we'll do it together. That's the helicopter parenting, yeah? More and more of that. But the most effective, according to the connectedness stuff, is actually, yeah, believing in them, making sure there's rules, so making sure sit down, shut up, listen, but negotiation, respect for that growing autonomy. Very similar message. And now all the research on resilience or protection or whatever you like to call it focuses on what environments we can create. How can we create the environments where relationships like that can occur? In our families, in our schools, in our hospitals, in our GP practices, in our communities. How can we create an environment where people feel they belong, where there's respect for their growing capacity, and they know the rules, they feel safe? Part of that is making sure that people understand that confidentiality stuff. So everybody knows about Gillick, Mrs. Gillick? Yeah. So Mrs. Gillick actually at first said, I don't want my name ever mentioned again because now I'm world famous. I'm not sure if I like being world famous. But now she's actually saying, yes, it's really good to have my name after it. And what's the difference between Gillick competency and the normal competency? Okay, so just briefly, this is really important in terms of communication and brain development and how we relate and how we judge capacity to consent. Because in this country, consent is not based on age, it's based on capacity, it's based on competency. So you have to judge competency to know whether you need to bring in a guardian for a young person to make a decision to say, yes, I'll agree to what you've asked me to do, or whether you just go on how they are. So what do you need to make a decision? What kind of processes do you need? Brain development-wise, brain-wise, what brain functions when you're making a decision about something?
You need to have reasonable cognitive function in order to make a decision.
Can you break down the cognitive function?
So as far as if someone's presented to you to prescribe.
Well, you yourself. What do you need to make a decision? What capacity do you need in your brain?
Cognitive functions cultivated that are able to make good decisions.
How do you make good decisions? Understand?
Knowledge. So you need to have understand. So what do you need to understand especially? The risks, yeah? And consequences. So what ability do you need to understand risks and consequences? You need to be able to think in the future, don't you? You need to be able to imagine the future. Okay, so how far into the future can a 2-year-old think? They can't, yeah. They have no concept of time. Our 2-year-old, the youngest in our family, is she's really cognizant of time because everybody's rushing around saying we have to go and it's time. So she says to her dad, what time we leave? And her dad teases her like mad and says, 24 plus 24. And she says, oh, okay. And she knows that you can delay going to bed. So she says, can I have 4 minutes? So Mum says, well, you can have 6. No, 4. She has no idea how long 4 minutes is, not a clue. She has no concept of time. But obviously that grows. What's the concept of time of an early puberty teenager? So like, I don't know, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 if you're a boy.
Whenever.
Whenever, okay. Well, this is not scientific, it's not proven, but it's just my rule of thumb, which I find quite useful, to find out how far in advance they can think. So I usually say, how long have you been with your boyfriend or your girlfriend? And obviously, most of them aren't thinking about sex at all, but you've got to have one. You notice that? Yeah. So what do you think they say normally?
2 weeks.
Ages is their normal response. Anybody who says ages, I actually assume, you should never assume, but ages, they say. So then I say, was that last weekend or the weekend before? And they often go, a month, miss, or, you know, that, but I don't care. Well, I do care, but at the same time, what I want to know is how far in advance can they think? Because if I'm giving them a decision that requires advanced thinking in terms of into the future, then I know that they may need a guardian if they haven't got that far in advance. Okay, so that's number one. Second thing is the ability to abstract think or to think about thinking. So when you're reading a story to a 3-year-old, do they get the meaning without you having to tell them? It's a bit like the fairy tales at the beginning, isn't it? It's very literal. I still don't like red apples because if you bite into one, you're going to sleep for 1,000 years. Yeah? They're very concrete, aren't they? So as that develops, the ability to think about thinking develops probably in this time span, in this teenage time. So you need to find out how they're thinking. So when you're doing heads, and we'll talk about heads later, what you need to do is find out how concrete are they. And a brilliant question is, if you like, don't ask it the right way, ask it the wrong way in terms of what's home like. Now the concrete thinkers will go, well, it's got a brown front door, it's got 2 chimneys, and it's got an upstairs. The abstract thinkers will get what you mean and say, oh, it's okay, everybody gets on. Yeah? Listen to how they're answering your questions. And that's really why Head starts off with the chatty stuff, because you're listening. I mean, you do want to know with the context of their lives, but you're listening to how they answer. That's why I refuse to ever have Heads as a tick box thing on paper or on computer. Because the information is useful and important, but more important is how are they answering? What kind of answers are they giving in terms of concrete or abstract? Because then if you're explaining a decision, trying to find out how competent they are to understand, you need to understand whether they're concrete or abstract thinkers. Because the way you explain it is going to be different, that's number one. And the other thing is the way they understand it is going to be different. So really important to gauge that. And the third thing you need to gauge is how complex they're thinking. How many connections have they got lit up, basically? How many connections are online? So how many choices would you give an 8-year-old? So somebody maybe not even started puberty. 2, this or nothing. How many would you give a 15-year-old? 2, this or nothing. Yeah, maybe a few more. But don't give more, too many. I was a parent who believed that, you know, you give your children choices because then they learn how to make choices. So I go, well, you can do this and this would happen. You could do this and this would happen. You could do this and this would happen. And they go, no, Mum, no many choices. They were overwhelmed, not enough connections. So really important to work out how many connections they can handle in one time. How many ideas can they handle at one time? Because if Gillick competency says it's about their capacity, but it's also about the nature of the decision. So it's not just finding out how competent they are to understand what you've just told them, both the things that they would happen if they don't do it and the things that would happen if they do, but you've also got to find out how much they're understanding in terms of that complexity, but it's about the decision itself as well. So if it's about the pill, and you've done all those things, then that's about me, it's about now, doesn't really affect much in the future, apart from not getting pregnant, and at the time. So it's pretty easy, and so you can have a fairly low level of competency, if you like, to make that decision. But if it's about gender, and it's going to affect the rest of your life, and it's about a permanent change in how you are and who you are, then that's quite a different nature of decision. So you don't have to really look for a far greater level of competency than if it was just about the pill. Does that make sense? So that's why it's so important to make that assessment. When you're meeting with a young person, you're judging them. What level of development are they at? Both socially, mentally, cognitively, physically. But they're also judging you, don't forget. And they're going, is this somebody I can trust? Is this somebody who's going to be accepting? Is this somebody who's going to believe in me? Is this somebody who just hasn't got a clue? Who's a bit grouchy? So don't forget, you're giving out messages as well as they're you're kind of trying to give them messages. So really important to bear that in mind. So confidentiality, if they have capacity to consent, they have capacity to have their information kept confidential, no matter what age they are. And that's Section 11 of the Privacy Act. I like to think of information as a lawyer explained it to me, actually, a privacy lawyer explained it. I thought it was brilliant. It's a bit like, your information is a bit like your most precious sports car or precious belonging. Cars are often next to the houses, the next most expensive things. And would you give that to somebody who drives it recklessly? No, you wouldn't. So you want to know, if you're going to lend your car to somebody, that they're going to be a responsible driver and they're not going to crash it or leave it behind somewhere. So it's exactly the same with information. You're not going to give it to somebody you don't trust. You're not going to give it to somebody who you know is going to blab and tell everybody. No way. So really important that we explain confidentiality in terms of that, but don't get yourselves backed into a corner. Don't say everything's confidential and then the next breath they tell you, well, I've got some pills in my pocket and I'm going to go home and take them all. You're not going to tell anybody, are you? You just promised. So standard, I'm sure all of you do it, but standard phrases that I use is everything's confidential except if I'm really worried about your safety. Whether you're going to harm yourself, you're going to harm others, or somebody else is harming you. And in that case, I'm going to need to tell somebody else in order to help you better. And that's the most important phrase. And I've not yet met anybody who said no. Because they recognize I can't do everything. I'm not anything super. And I'm going to have to get help. And often the best way of doing it, if they are reluctant, is to say, well, okay, let's imagine how we're going to tell mum. Maybe we could role play a bit and practice it. And then it doesn't seem so bad. When I worked at family planning, I used to see kids who would start on the pill, and I'd say, well, are you going to tell mum that you're starting on the pill? Oh no, she'd hit the roof. Oh, okay, well, maybe we could think about how you could tell her so she doesn't hit the roof. So I said, do you watch Shortland Street? And they say, oh, sometimes. And then they go, do you ever watch with your mum? Oh, sometimes. Okay, so when you're watching with your mum, just sit next to her and there's always somebody getting pregnant on Shortland Street. So just say to her, Mum, do you think young women should get pregnant? And what do you think your mum would say? Oh, she'd probably say no. Okay, so then you could say to her, well, do you think they should be on the pill? And what do you think she'd say? Oh, she'd probably say, yeah. So then you could say, well, I am. And everybody would laugh, just like you did. I don't think anybody did it that way, although I had one young woman came back and told me that's what she'd done and it had gone well. But I don't think but it relieved the tension. And they realized their parents were humans as well, and it role-played how they could, and they didn't have to do it like that, but it just helped them see that actually it's doable. And in terms of confidentiality with parents, I always try and encourage the young person to tell their parent. Rather than me telling them. Or sometimes I'll say, do you want me to talk to your parents to get them off your back? And they'll go, would you? And then we agree on what we're going to say to them. So really important to get that communication going between the parents and the young person though. So if a parent rings up, again, at family planning, I was the one who dealt with all the complaints. And they say, I found a pill. How dare you? And didn't tell me. So why do you think they got so angry? Or get angry, it's not got.
So the person didn't talk to them.
Yeah. So there's this little girl, and she's part of me, and she told me everything up till now, and then this most important thing, she's not talked to me. It's a grieving thing, isn't it? And grief often comes out as anger. Yeah? So so again, you do a sort of more of a reverse technique, and you go, oh yes, it's really hard. Acknowledge the emotion. Adults the same as adolescents, more especially with adolescents, but adults the same. Oh, that's really sad, isn't it? It's really hard when you realise they're growing up and they don't need you so much anymore. It's really, really hard. But hey, haven't you done a good job bringing her up because she's learned how to look after herself? Isn't that wonderful? And it really takes the wind out of people's sails when they kind of think differently and don't focus on themselves, but focus on their young person and their behaviour. And hey, they've done a pretty good job, actually. They've learned how to do it for themselves. And why don't you talk to her about it? And say, hey, you know, you can talk to me, I'm more than happy. And think about why didn't they talk to you? I don't usually go into that far because it's a bit too confrontational. But, you know, that's what you're implying. Yeah. Okay, any questions about that? Yep.
Can I just ask about the exceptions? I had a situation recently where I did my confidentiality talk in the exceptions, and the answer came back, can I then have a choice about who you talk to? And I wasn't sure if I was being backed into a corner, they would be choosing a person who wouldn't respond or wouldn't help, or if there was a genuine question. And I really sort of stumbled.
I think that's really valid. And you say, yep, you can have a choice. Who would you like to talk to? And then say, so how are they going to help if I tell them? What are they going to do? I need to be reassured that you're not going to be harmed. Yep, that's great, we can talk about that. And I usually try and say, how should we tell them? What would you like me to tell them? But these are the things I need to tell them. And then try and ring up on the phone while they're there. So they know that I've stuck to it, and that trust then increases.
Yeah, I thought one of my patients, when we talk about confidentiality, is she said, like, I don't care, no one wants to know my story. So what's the best answer?
Gosh, validate the emotion. I'm really sorry you feel like that. It must be really hard that you feel nobody cares about you. But hey, you know what? I care about you. And I care about you enough to keep you safe. So I'm hoping you're going to trust me to do that by allowing me to tell this other person. And usually they're okay with that. Yeah, yeah. But it is hard. And one time I had somebody come in, in fact it was a really good lesson of doing heads on every visit, because this young woman had been to our centre about 3 times before for the pill. And whether nobody had asked her about her mental health or whether she hadn't chosen to tell them, I'm not sure, but it was nothing in the notes about it. And she was brought in by her friends because she tried to run under a bus. And it turned out when we did some history taking that she'd actually cut her wrist 6 months before. Nobody knew except her boyfriend. And I thought, gosh, you know, if somebody had done heads, they might have found out what her mood level was like when she come for the pill. But at the same time, also, we then had to say, well, look, I'm going to have to tell your mum. And she said, no, you can't tell my mum, you can't tell anybody. So I said, well, look, you know, you've suffered on your own all this time. Maybe it might be quite good. Do you think your mum might have guessed something? You know, she's not that far distant from you. And maybe she might have got an inkling and she's really worried about you. And that's another good point about brain development, because as these are collecting, they sometimes get twisted. So often young people will see anxiety on an adult's face and think they're angry. And this young one was the same. She thought her mother would be angry, but actually she was really anxious. But she thought her mother was angry with her, so she wouldn't talk to her about her mood. So I said, look, I'm sorry, we're going to ring your mum. And this is what I'm going to say, is that okay? So she said, oh, all right. So mum came, And there was tears, lots of hugging, and Mum said, "At last, you're talking to me, I've been so worried about you." And daughter had thought she was angry. So again, as practitioners, we need to make sure that our faces aren't expressing anxiety and they're reading anger. Oh, that doctor, she's always angry. So really important that we make sure that verbalize what's on our faces. I'm anxious about you. I'm not angry with you. And same for parents. So I think that you just have to say, well, I'm going to, but this is what I'm going to say. And usually it turns out all right, but not always, and then you have to deal with the consequences. Yeah. But if you do it in that kind of way, I think the trust doesn't disappear too much. But obviously, if you just say, well, sorry, it's my duty, I've got to do this, then you've lost that trust. They may never go to a doctor or a nurse again. So it's really important you build up to it, I think. Yeah.
Can I ask, with that example that you gave, so suppose that young woman had needed to urgently engage with mental health services through the district health board, how would the Gala competency apply in that situation? Because it seems to me that that's a bit of a murky area as to when you judge that someone's competent to give consent in terms of consenting or needing to kick in the Mental Health Act. And I just wondered what...
And I think that's true for any age, to be honest. And it's not really about intellectual capacity, it's almost about emotional capacity. And it's really hard, isn't it? I mean, when do you insist that somebody goes to a mental illness hospital? And I talk about, and we'll talk about mental health in a minute, but another big crusade of mine is let's stop talking about mental health when we mean mental illness. Because if we talk about mental health as if it's mental illness, how are we going to talk about maintaining mental health? So referring somebody to the mental ill health system is really tricky, because people with psychosis, people with alcohol and drug addictions do not think they need to go. And when do you bring in the act and say, well, sorry, you've got to go? When do you bring in the act for suicidal young people who have had trauma in their lives, who persist in self-harming to the extent that they could die? When do you bring that into effect? It's really hard. So it's about that relationship, I think, and building up that relationship. So I try not to refer people on their first visit unless they're, really at risk. Because if you can build up that trust even by the second visit, then they'll be happy to go because they trust who you trust. It's just what they said in the pamphlet I've given out. Whereas if you just refer them, they go, well, in the pamphlet, the young people said, in our research, they said, oh, I must be really serious. And their anxiety goes skyrocketing because that person can't cope with me. Oh no, it must be really bad. Or they think, oh, that person hates me. And they just flick me off. So I think you've got to build up that trust if you can, if you've got time, and think of other ways to keep them safe before you refer. And that's why I try and get parents involved, and then the parent can go with them to ill health system if that's necessary. Often if you get their parents involved, it's not so necessary. But sometimes it is. Absolutely.
I've seen the opposite of that a young person might consent that they need help urgently, and you'd think, yes, that's consent, but the District Health Board service kicks in the Mental Health Act because they say that if that person is absconded, they've got no means to bring that person back. And I've really struggled with that thinking. Yeah. And Me too. It's like, well, the person's agreed to accept help. Why make it harder? Yeah. And I don't know if that's actually been tested in law, because they say if we rang the police to pick up that person who's absconded, if we haven't got the Mental Health Act in place, they could just keep going, and we've got no means to legally bring them back. But that's their interpretation of it.
Yeah, and that's really interesting, because actually, I don't know about in Wellington or any other place, but in Christchurch, the police are our best social workers. They are amazing. They've become the mental health social workers of society, just about. And they're amazing the way they pick people up and bring them into hospital. Incredible. They really have become more like social workers than policemen, which is fantastic because they actually have the law backing them to say, yes, you have to come with me. And also patients see that, and so they do come. I mean, sometimes with a struggle, but they have that kind of backing. So yeah, I mean, yes, that's an interpretation, I think.
Yeah, I think it's used more liberally than what one would hope.
Yeah. And again, some hospitals use that much more liberally than others. Yeah. But yeah, I think that communication is the thing to focus on. Yeah, without a doubt. In terms of parents and how you get rid of them, I mean, how you help them, to be honest, I think it's really good when the parent comes in. What do you learn when the parent brings the young person in? What their relationship's like, what their connection's like, absolutely. So you learn heaps by having them in. You also learn stuff about past history, family history, medications that the young person may not know or doesn't care about and, you know, doesn't want to tell you. So you learn heaps. So why would you want to get rid of them?
Because
Yeah, because it's too embarrassing. What are the big barriers for access to healthcare for young people?